Jane Hughes lived with her grandmother from the age of 7, and therefore the girl saw her grandmother's farm as the best place on earth. The girl was taught to help out on the farm as soon as she moved there, and it was virtually the only source of income for the family. Jane fed the chickens and sheep, helped with the harvest, and even milked the cows. Meanwhile, the girl didn't feel exploited and took it all as a part of life. Before the move, Jane used to live in the city, but after her parents got divorced, Jane and her mother decided to live with her grandma, Samantha. Samantha Hughes was a smart woman, and therefore she let her daughter and granddaughter move in with her without asking any questions. Jane liked her grandmother's house for one simple reason. She didn't have to witness her parents fighting anymore. And Mrs. Hughes was a kind and sympathetic woman who doted on her only granddaughter. She didn't condemn her daughter, even though she'd always suspected that she was rushing into marriage and that it would eventually end in a divorce. Samantha was well aware of what youthful mistakes could lead to, and therefore she never criticized her daughter and tried to support her in all of her endeavors. At first, the move didn't cause any problems for anyone. The whole family worked for the common good, spending their days busy on the farm. But when Jane started school, it turned out that her peers disliked her at first sight. The girl had no idea why it happened, but other kiddos started making fun of her virtually on the first day of school. It just so happened that everyone knew each other in that small village and had each other's back, while Jane was an outsider who came from the big city. The kiddos seemed to be competing to see who would come up with the most offensive nicknames for Jane, causing her to shed a lot of tears. Of course, the girl tried not to let her family know about it and behaved as if nothing was wrong. Nevertheless, Jane was deeply hurt by the fact that her peers saw her as an outsider. Nothing changed until the 6th grade, at which point Jane met Patrick. For some inexplicable reason, the other kiddos were afraid of him. He was tall for his age and knew a lot of things that kiddos his age weren't supposed to know. Since Patrick's parents died in a car accident, he was raised by his grandmother. Of course, it was hard for the elderly woman to keep track of her grandson, and therefore he often got into all kinds of trouble. Patrick could easily climb into someone else's apple garden just to treat his friends to fresh fruit, or go miles away from home to have a swim in the river or fish. If Tom Sawyer had lived at that time, Patrick would have definitely made a great Huckleberry Finn for him. The first time Patrick saw Jane was when some boys were chasing her down the street, intending to grab the girl by the braid. "Hey, what do you think you're doing? The 3 of you chasing one girl? How about chasing me instead?" Patrick asked. The bullies turned pale as soon as they saw him. They knew Patrick's reputation very well. It was rumored that his grandmother was a real witch. Of course, it was all a lie, but Patrick was great at using other people's fears for his own purposes. Having made a terrible grimace, Patrick snorted, which made the boys run away in an instant. "Wow, how did you get them to run away?" Jane whispered, stunned. "Come on, that wasn't hard," Patrick replied with a smile. The boy was used to taking care of himself from an early age, and therefore he wasn't afraid to face difficulties. His grandmother didn't know it, but Patrick had been working part-time on the neighbor's land for a couple of seasons. We weeded corn and helped with harvesting. Patrick used the money he earned to buy school supplies and clothes. Unfortunately, the boy rarely went to school, once or twice a week at most. He only did it so that the principal wouldn't show up at his house to check up on him. Patrick had an old bicycle, which he used to ride all around the surrounding areas. The boy loved speed and felt that if he pedaled hard enough, he would one day be able to fly up into the sky. When Jane first saw Patrick, she was even more afraid of him than of the 3 bullies that were chasing her. But after talking to him for a bit, she realized that all the rumors about him that were going around the village weren't actually true. Patrick was a kind boy who pretended that his grandmother was a witch so that no one would bother him. After that memorable incident, Patrick and Jane became friends. It was Jane who insisted that her new friend needed to start going to school every day. Patrick resisted at first, but then he realized that school wasn't actually hard and even started to enjoy studying. Jane helped the boy study some of the subjects, but he could handle most of them on his own. As time went on, Jane and Patrick's friendship grew stronger and stronger. Looking at the teenagers walking arm in arm, Samantha Hughes smiled mysteriously, hinting to her daughter that their match was made in heaven. "Come on, Mom. "What match are you talking about? They're just friends." Penelope brushed her mother off. When Patrick started his senior year, he used the money he'd earned working on the farm and bought himself a motorcycle. Of course, it was old and broke almost every day. But Patrick didn't lose heart. He was good with tools, so he tirelessly worked on his bike, imagining himself as a doctor who could cure his bike's illness. Thanks to his determination and perseverance, the young man eventually managed to replace all the old parts of his bike, which made its engine run like clockwork. Patrick liked to ride his bike on the highway and feel the whistling of the wind in his ears. Unfortunately, the young man barely ever wore his helmet, which he contemptuously called the astronaut suit. Of course, Jane was against Patrick's recklessness, but she couldn't do anything about it, especially since she was quite busy singing in the city choir at the time. Jane had a beautiful voice, and anyone who'd ever heard her perform expected her to become a singer. Nevertheless, the young woman tried not to get too hung up on this idea and dreamed of going to college and studying economics. It was partly because of her mother, who never grew tired of repeating that first Jane needed to achieve financial independence and only then start thinking about making her dreams come true. Samantha Hughes turned out to have been right, and by the time of their high school graduation, Jane and Patrick had already gotten engaged. They didn't want to rush with the wedding because the young people believed that they had their whole lives ahead of them. Moreover, they already saw themselves as husband and wife as it was. Who cares about some piece of paper or some ceremony? We can do it whenever, even tomorrow if we wanted to, Patrick said. If only the young people could have known how wrong he was. Everything changed in an instant. One day, Patrick went to the pharmacy in the pouring rain to get meds for his grandmother. There was poor visibility on the road, but the young man didn't care. Trying to get the most out of his motorcycle, Patrick stubbornly pressed on the gas, ignoring the rain that was getting on his face. The young man had never driven so fast before. Patrick was sure that everything would be fine. It was only when he saw a huge truck in front of him that he realized that he misjudged the situation and thus had to drive into the oncoming lane. Patrick had no time to finish his maneuver. The last thing he heard in his life was the screeching of brakes and the grinding of metal. The impact was so strong that the young man died on the spot, and the paramedics who had arrived at the scene had no choice but to declare him dead. At this very moment, Jane was at a rehearsal with the city choir and didn't even suspect that she just lost her closest and most beloved person in the whole world. The news of Patrick's death devastated her. "What do you mean he died in an accident? Why would he even drive in such rain?" Jane refused to believe what she was being told. The young woman felt like it was some kind of mistake and that it would soon clear up as soon as Patrick would come to pick her up after the rehearsal. But seeing the tear-stained face of her grandmother, Jane understood that it was all true. At that time, there wasn't a single person in the village who didn't feel terrible about Patrick's death. Even the fact that his grandmother was allegedly a witch didn't seem to be important anymore. After her fiancé's death, Jane began to wither before everyone's eyes. The young woman felt as if her life was over and there would never be anything good in it ever again. She couldn't even leave her room for hours and sobbed quietly, burying her face in the pillow. Samantha Hughes tried to support her granddaughter as best as she could, but there was nothing she could do to make Jane feel better. "Time heals all wounds. You'll see eventually. You'll be able to live with this pain," the old woman said with tears in her eyes. Jane had to go through a lot before she could come to terms with her fiancé's passing. It was actually her mother's decision to move back to the city that helped her. "Jane needs a change of scenery. Life is different in the city. It might be easier for her there," Penelope said to her mother. This time, Samantha Hughes had no choice but to admit that her daughter was right. A week later, Jane and her mother returned to the city. Having rented a small house on the outskirts, they firmly decided to start a new life. Unfortunately, that wasn't exactly easy to do, since the financial situation of the Hughes family remained as unstable as it always was. Jane started college just as she planned, and her mother got a job at a roadside cafe, which was mostly frequented by bikers and truckers. Time flew by. Having devoted herself to her studies, Jane finished college and became one of its best graduates. Then, one of Jane's professors helped her get a job in a good firm, which always valued determined and responsible employees. Jane greatly surprised everyone when she managed to go from the intern position to the head of the department in record time. Finally, the woman got a taste of the prosperous life her mother always talked about. In all those years, she never forgot about Patrick, although she did resign herself to his death. Jane never managed to really connect with anyone else. Sure, she made some attempts, but none of them ended in anything serious. Deep down, Jane didn't mind living her life with Patrick still in her head and in her heart. One day, when Jane was returning home from work, she saw a boy who looked a lot like Patrick. The boy's clothes were a bit of a mess, but he didn't care. He was busy launching paper boats down the streams of rainwater, completely disregarding all the people that were rushing by. "Hi, kid. How are you?" Jane asked with a friendly smile. "Good evening, ma'am. I'm doing fine, thanks. I'm launching boats here," the boy answered as if it was nothing special. Even his voice sounded like Patrick's, so much so actually that it even made Jane wince. Having exchanged a couple of words with the boy, Jane found out that his name was Kevin and he was an orphan. "Why aren't you at an orphanage then?" the young woman asked. "I run away sometimes. The caregivers are very strict. They won't let me play in the park and launch my paper boats," the boy answered. At that moment, Jane felt like she was having a déjà vu. The fact was that Patrick was exactly the same when he was a kid. He valued freedom above everything else, which was why he loved his bike so much. Jane came home later than usual that day. Moreover, she wasn't alone, but with Kevin. Seeing the boy at the door, Penelope raised an eyebrow in surprise and started waiting for an explanation from her daughter. But Jane had no intention of explaining anything. She simply decided to adopt Kevin and became his mother. Of course, she had no illusions that Kevin would somehow become a replacement for Patrick, who had passed away several years ago. Fortunately, there weren't any problems with the adoption process. Jane's level of income allowed her to adopt the boy without any issues. Thus, Kevin started living a new life, having left the gray walls of the orphanage behind him. Now he spent his days doing what he loved most in the world. At the same time, Jane never infringed on his freedom and always tried to compromise. Every weekend, the woman went to visit Patrick's grave. She believed that it was Patrick who sent her this sweet little boy named Kevin as a sort of a message from heaven. 20 years flew by. Kevin grew up and started his own family. First, he had a son, whom the young father named Patrick. Of course, he remembered well all the stories his adoptive mother told him, and therefore considered this name worthy of his son. Meanwhile, Jane looked at her son's family and felt truly happy that she'd gotten a chance to not only be a mother, but also a grandmother.